Welcome to the Canadian Business Quarterly podcast, where we speak with Canada's most influential industry leaders on the business and economic development issues taking place across the country. You can stay up to date with all of our content, including our publications, newsletters, and podcasts by visiting www.thecbq.ca and clicking on subscribe.
Today's guest is Peter Downing, Executive Director of Alberta Fights Back, a newly founded political movement with the aim of Alberta secession. Peter has lived in Alberta since graduating from the RCMP Training Academy Depot Division in 2006. He has project management training from the University of Alberta, change management certification from Presky International, and is a Lean Six Sigma Black Belt from Villanova University. Peter, thanks for speaking with us today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jess.
So, all right, this movement has started because of the perception that Alberta is getting screwed over by the rest of Canada. So why don't we just start with that?
Okay, sure. The main issue, the main political issue, if you were to boil it down to its lowest common denominator, is the ability to develop our natural resource, so a resource-based economy. With the regulation right now out of Ottawa with Bill C-69, tanker bans, expanded regulatory process for approvals on pipeline expansion. And right now we are basically at capacity for our crude oil exports. We're suffering. Before it was okay when the price of oil was higher. But the price of oil is pretty low right now. So, we don't have the expanded, we are at capacity right now, and we are unable to develop further capacity. And basically that, we have no ability to control that. That comes out of Ottawa. And right now because of that, and the history of that, the history of the control over our natural resources, which was always supposed to be a provincial power within Confederation, now isn't. So we're basically at the mercy of a political and an economic situation with Eastern Canada, in particular Quebec, where the political and the economic interests are opposed to ours. And we have a federal government that strongly favors Quebec. So we have to look at our situation and what we can do about it logically, legally, ethically. And this is the strongest option that we have.
Okay. So two questions from there. The first one that's going to be, can you explain, I guess, this mandated capping on the export of oil production? This is being handed down federally. I understand. Just basically
we're basically at our capacity. The mandated. Are you talking about the mandated cuts that our provincial government imposed on us?
Well, you had just suggested a moment ago that these are capped exports. So I'm just trying to get a better overview.
No, I'm not. For sure. No, I'm not suggesting that it's a capped export. I'm basically saying that we need expanded pipeline construction to be able to export more of our natural resource to be able to make up for the revenue shortfall. And we're unable to develop. Quebec has stated that there is no social acceptability for the Energy East. And when we see that the government of Quebec is heavily invested in a company like SNC-Lavalin, who is very heavily invested in Saudi oil and gas projects, we start to question the purity of the motive. When we want to expand through Trans Mountain, we have the government of British Columbia exceedingly hostile towards our ability to develop. And when you look at the electoral politics side of it, there's a federal election this fall. The Liberals are looking to at least keep or expand their majority. And from an electoral perspective, I really do understand why the Trudeau government would want to virtue signal with environmental overtures to British Columbia, which has a very, environmentally conscious electorate, and the folks in Quebec who want to protect their industry, as we've seen come out of the SNC-Lavalin scandal. There's a huge motive to be able to protect Quebec industry. So it's the same sort of thing here, and we're kind of fighting a war on two fronts, economically and politically. And it really is a situation like, what options other than this do we have to take into our own hands to be able to take back the initiative, to be able to drive our industry, to be able to drive the thousands and thousands of workers in Alberta and their families who thrive off this industry and the secondary industries that come out of it.
Okay. And can you just elaborate what, when you talk about the government favoring Quebec? I mean, the idea of sort of a West versus East battle isn't anything new, but Western Canadians are more aware of subsidies being sent out east. But what can you tell me about this battle between West and East when it comes to issues of taxation, government subsidies, provincial funding?
Yeah, and you touched on it, Jess, and I think that's actually a secondary issue because Alberta's been part of the Confederation for quite some time, and we've been subsidizing the rest of the country through equalization payments for quite some time, with Quebec being the largest beneficiary of those subsidies. And basically, it's the tax money that we pay that goes to the government that they reallocate to the different provinces under the auspices of trying to maintain a reasonably similar standard of public services. So when we look at in Alberta from the Western Canadian perspective, when we're looking at Quebec, who hold a large political sway within Canadian Confederation. Ironically, they never signed the repatriation document, but when we see that they're a recipient of $13.1 billion this year, and they're actively hostile towards the Alberta oil and gas sector, it really is more of an insult to injury thing. Albertans, we've always been hard workers. We're pretty generous. We've never really grumbled too much because we have, we are able to generate. We've got a very strong oil and gas and resource economy. So we've never minded chipping into Confederation and, in fact, over contributing to Confederation. But when it's our time for help and our time, and not even help, just for folks, the other political actors to get out of the way and let us do our job, we see this antagonism and hostility. And so the equalization and those kinds of subsidies really, we get our backs up when we see that double whammy, so to speak.
Okay. Now, with this SNC-Lavalin scandal is a big deal at the moment, but you've mentioned once or twice now previously about Quebec's involvement with them as an organization and their support of Arab oil. Can you just, tie the links together for us about how that's affecting the export of Alberta oil?
Well, at least to the East Coast. And, there, for instance, there is we have a West Coast tanker ban, that we can't export our oil offshore. We can't run our pipelines east, but there's no, for anybody who thinks that it's environmental, that there's a West Coast tanker ban. Well, there's certainly no East Coast tanker ban that allows Saudi Arabian, Nigerian, oils from other countries that have terrible human rights records. And when we look at Alberta and obviously being part of the Canadian Confederation, our strong support of human rights and environmental protection, we can't take it at face value when we're told that this is about the environment, or this is about some other kind of larger virtue. We would call it what it is, and it's political. And it's protectionism. It's Eastern Canadian, Quebec in particular, economic protectionism. They want cut a competitor out, and Alberta's their competitor.
But I mean, it sounds pretty egregious, because if what I'm hearing is what you're telling me, we're actively importing Arab oil that's coming in, I assume through the lakes into Quebec, but we're banning Alberta oil, which is beneficial not only to the province but to the nation, and as part of these subsidy payments for Quebec. On the surface, it doesn't seem to make any sense.
Well, it does. It's on the surface, and in fact, it's not ethical. It's absolutely unethical. But if you're looking to the level that for instance, just to the extent that the Trudeau government would go to, however anybody views Jody Wilson-Raybould's testimony, she said that there was political pressure put on her to offer the deferred prosecution agreement to SNC-Lavalin. Obviously, being convicted of bribery offenses, that would cut them out of the ability to, I believe, to bid on government contracts. A number of red flags have been raised throughout the OECD about bribery now in Canada. And to the extent, and even the articles, the media reports about how the protection of SNC-Lavalin by the Trudeau government would lead to more seats and a better electoral result in Quebec and in Montreal in the next federal election. There seems to be a strong cultural preference within Quebec, and again, just as an outsider, but many share the same opinion, is that there is a willingness to forsake ethics, for lack of a better term, or even the law, to be able to support a homegrown corporation in an industry. So it doesn't make sense if you're looking at the ethics or the fairness of it, but it does make sense if you're looking at the sheer self-interest.
So is this, are we hearing you right? Because, a lot of people don't, they're working their own day jobs and they don't have the opportunity to absorb everything as it comes through. But are you effectively implying that the government is turning an eye to what SNC-Lavalin is setting up with contracts and allowing this oil to come through for the benefit of their company over an entire province of Alberta?
Well, looking at the meta level and not necessarily tying SNC-Lavalin directly to the importation of Saudi oil and gas and the ban, on the East Coast, but banning the export of it on the West Coast, is it just seems to be a strong preference for Quebec economic and political interest over and against Alberta economic and political interests, draining the West to bribe the East, for lack of a better term, through the equalization payments that you touched on earlier.
And this is, there's been rumblings of this for the last few years, but the idea of an actual Alberta secessionist movement is a relatively new development. Do you want to just sort of take me through how we've gotten to this point that this is now actually a thing?
Sure. I'd actually go back to history. It's a little bit longer than that, and would go back to the 70s during when Trudeau's father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, was the prime minister. And it was the same sort of thing. And the big thing that got folks, the industries back up, was oil export taxes. So basically an additional tax on the exportation of our natural resources. Again, there's clear division of natural resources versus federal jurisdiction versus provincial jurisdiction when it comes to confederation. And resource development is provincial matters. So in the 70s, later 70s, folks started to get their back up that it seemed to be a grab of Alberta resources. And there was a lot of hostility there. The separatist movement kicked up. Kind of fast forward, Peter Lougheed, the governor of Alberta, basically, he was able to soothe the anger somewhat. And after Trudeau didn't win the next round of office, that anger started to subside. But people in Alberta definitely remember the National Energy Program, and the Liberal Party, whether it's the Liberal Party of Canada or the Liberal Party of Alberta, have a bad brand in Alberta in particular. So fast forward to when Trudeau Jr. becomes Prime Minister. And again, the ups and downs and, contracts being awarded during Mulroney's time, contracts being awarded to Quebec firms. So the Quebec versus the West has always sort of been a theme. But when Justin Trudeau got elected, and the price of oil took a hit, and then we started to see Bill C-69, so the extended regulatory process for pipeline expansion, Northern Gateway, Energy East gets killed. Quebec says there's no social acceptability for Alberta oil. Now we're trying to do Trans Mountain, and the government of BC is blocking us. And again, the West Coast tanker ban. So it seems to be tied in with almost the recent political history of Stephen Harper's time in government, or the Conservative Party's time in government, which was more of a Western Canadian power center. It almost seems like it is the kind of more traditional, the Laurentian elite is the term that's used in the older cities in Quebec and Ontario, reasserting their dominance over the West, trying to claim virtues of environmentalism, gender equality, but really it's pure power in politics. And right now, again, with the history with the first Trudeau, the history with the current prime minister, and even the Conservative government takes office, they are still electorally bound to the number of seats that are in Ontario and Quebec. To give you a contrast, the province of Alberta has 34 seats within the House of Commons. The city of Toronto alone has 25, and the city of Montreal alone has 10. So you have two old stock cities that are basically that have been financial power centers since Confederation, outvoting the whole province just themselves. And there's a lot more liberal and socialist voters there as well. So it makes it really tough for us to be able to have any sense of autonomy or control over, over our own economy. So there's kind of, it isn't a recent history, it's a longer history. There was a separatist member of Legislative Assembly elected to the Alberta legislature already once in the writing of Olds Disbury, I believe, Gordon Kessler. But now it's kind of front and center more with all the factors in the history and the politics kind of coming together for this perfect storm. This why Angus Reid found that 60% of Albertans are willing to vote separatists. And in fact, as of today, an official separatist party in Alberta, the Alberta Independence Party, has been registered with Elections Alberta. And so it's this is now a real electoral option in Alberta. But you've also got Saskatchewan, I believe, has 53% of people voting willing to separate. And Manitoba is quite a bit lower, but 36%. 36% are considering leaving Canada. So you have this, you have the prairie provinces, which could serve as an effective political and economic bloc, controlling well over $1 trillion of natural resources. And we're told by conservative politicians, federally and provincially, is don't split the vote for us, we're the best that you can do. But it really is. People here having their economic future, their livelihoods controlled by Eastern Canada, particularly in Quebec.
And Alberta Fights Back is an independent organization, but just from the way that you're talking and the organization of this group, it's clear that you have political campaign experience behind you. So, are you aligned with any other groups as part of this movement, or whether yourself or?
No, actually, we're not. I can tell you a little bit about the development. I started Alberta Fights Back in January of this year, recognizing that there were groups like the Alberta Independence Party, a few other separatist-minded groups or smaller splinter conservative groups trying to, get registration. And I recognized that there needed to be a little bit more, development of the separation message or the political message or the political education around this issue. So I started the organization as a political action committee, a third-party independent advertiser with Elections Alberta. And so as we launched our first round of billboards on February 19th, asking the question, should Alberta ditch Canada, on digital billboards in Edmonton and Calgary. And we had a very strong response, media response, donor, volunteer response. After that, I got invited to join the leadership team with a group called the Prairie Freedom Movement, who's basically been doing the same thing at more of a prairie regional level for the past 3 years. And since 2016, this same messaging within the three prairie provinces. And then we launched the Should Saskatchewan Leave Canada campaign and in Regina and Saskatoon. And the media response was even bigger at that time. And then from there, we launched in Manitoba last week, asking should Manitoba exit Canada. And we've had a response there as well, too. So looking at it from a political power perspective and where we're going is in the process of the coordination to develop three co-branded separation parties at the provincial level in each of the prairie provinces. So to be able to, give a little bit more economy of scale in terms of negotiation and leverage with Ottawa. So in terms of being aligned with any political party, no, we're not. We are not aligned with any political party. In terms of funding and backing, it's me and the leadership group with the Prairie Freedom Movement. We kind of, again, just working together for economy of scale.
So is it all grassroots, or is there any, major donor sponsorship behind this?
No, it really is grassroots. We've had a lot of interest from some bigger political actors. We're starting to see more of industry reaching out to us. But it really is, folks who we may have some business background or public service experience, as well as some political experience, and just looking at the political marketplace and what voters want. We're offering a product that we don't think is being offered right now, and we're offering a product, a political product, political service, however you want to call it, and trying to package and market it in a way that it lines up with all the things that you need to be able to do to successfully build a brand, to build an organization.
One of the things that, not only people in Alberta, but we're a national title, so people over in the East are going to be listening to this as well. I grew up in Alberta, so I always remember hearing about these, but for a lot of people, they don't quite understand how equalization payment works and how money is being funded from Alberta out east. Do you want to just take us through why you see this as such a big problem? What sort of dollars we're talking about here?
Okay, well, Alberta's paid about $622 billion into Confederation, and the way it works, is basically it's our federal taxation. So we all pay federal taxes. We all pay equal amount of, it's standard. The person in Alberta doesn't, by virtue of living in Alberta, pay more federal tax. As an individual taxpayer, we do when it comes to some of our resources. But basically, those taxes go to all the federal expenditures, the cost of running federal government, plus social services or social benefits. More of those social benefits, much more of those, overwhelmingly more of those social benefits end up in Quebec. And so Quebec has things that Alberta doesn't have. Quebec has super low cost daycare that's very heavily subsidized. The cost of post-secondary education is heavily subsidized. So you have university grads in Quebec coming out of school virtually debt-free, as opposed to the Albertan who's up to their eyeballs in debt. I've seen
how
this.
Exactly does that work from a provincial and federal level? If they're funding daycare and university, these would typically be provincial programs, or how is it being changed federally between a couple of provinces?
So the funding is it's a wealth transfer of tax transfer, money transfer from the federal government to the province. The province gets to spend it however they want, and that's how the province in Quebec in particular spends it. Fertility treatments are subsidized in Quebec, and on numbers. So we're kind of seeing all these benefits, and I think part of the Canadian zeitgeist or the Canadian culture, whether you're in and especially in Western Canada, and I'm from Southern Ontario originally, is people don't like seeing other people butt in line. People don't like seeing other people get special treatment. And that's the thing, that's the underlying current that's rubbing people wrong, as we have 20,000 people out of work just in December alone in Alberta. And we're seeing our money transferred to other people for special interests, special benefits, special perks, special privileges. And that same group who's getting all those special treatments telling us that we can't develop our economy through their jurisdiction, which benefits everybody, kind of kicking us again while we're down. And that's the common thread.
Now,
so I hope that explains how
it does.
Basically how that. Okay, good.
It does. You've given me some numbers where you've suggested that 60% of Albertans are happy to entertain the idea of secession. That sounds significantly high to me versus what I've actually experienced in the province. But
sure.
We've tried this.
And that was an Angus Reid poll.
Okay. 25 years ago, generally speaking, the rest of Canada fought tooth and nail to keep Quebec as part of the country, and there's been a lot more separation sentiment from them as a peoples. And I think what people would I guess like to understand is that it seems pretty far off the idea of secession. So how can Alberta protect itself economically without going down that path?
Well, I currently don't think we can. I think this is how we're protecting ourselves, because it's gotten so bad politically. And I think that this is political education that voters in Ontario, particularly in the GTA, voters in Quebec, particularly in Montreal, and voters in British Columbia, particularly in Vancouver and the Lower Mainland, need to understand that this is a natural reaction to their own governments, the people that they've been electing, and the promises that those politicians have been making to them, to understanding it's those decisions that those voters have made that have been like kind of the first primary input into the feeling and the sentiment that we have in Alberta. So that's a start. The second piece, and talking hypotheticals here, and this is a battle that's been going on for quite some time, and obviously there isn't the political will to change it. But even slightly, and I still don't think this is a solution for the problem, but will be more of a precondition to be able to start to negotiate fairly, is some sort of representation at the Senate level. Currently, the Senate is appointed by the Prime Minister, and when the Prime Minister has a majority government, whoever he appoints, they know where they're getting their bread buttered. If you look even south of the border, that each state, regardless of the proportional representation, they do at least have 2 seats in the Senate to be able to represent state interest. So a model like that, where you've got an elected as well, where you have elected representatives who are representing regional concerns and interests. That, again, I don't think that's going to solve the problem. I don't even think that's going to be a reality in the current political situation. But again, I think that listeners across the country need to hear that this movement isn't based on national, cultural, those kind of issues that the Quebec referendum was based on. This is purely economics and politics, and basically trying to have some sort of ability to develop our economy, our way of life, our jobs, our futures, our careers, without being kneecapped and roadblocked by opposing political and economic interests within the same country that we all call home.
And why do you think the very briefly, you mentioned the prairie provinces is sort of the values and the culture of neighboring provinces like Saskatchewan and Manitoba are aligned. But why do you think that the values of a place like BC would be so different to ours when they're, argue closer than Winnipeg would be? For sure.
Well, in fact, if you're talking about the area or the region in the British Columbia, no, northern BC. So, for instance, places like Fort St. John, Dawson Creek, Prince. I can't get my princes mixed up. There's a Prince
Fort Nelson,
George, I think.
Prince George.
All those places for sure. They're all resource based as well. But the heavy concentration of the population is in the Lower Mainland and Vancouver Island, and they have a very strong left wing political view. They tend to fall hook, line, and sinker with some of the American propaganda, which says that Alberta oil is dirty, because they already had that predisposition for the environment. It's a very emotional issue for them, but they don't really, they haven't vetted or fact checked that propaganda that's coming out of the U.S. to be able to keep Alberta oil landlocked, to basically send the Americans discounted crude oil that they have the ability to refine and sell at full price on the world market. So this is I really think it's a political education, a political discussion that needs to happen, a civic discussion. This is what democracy is. This is political engagement at its rawest. And I think this is where the rest of the country really should start to look at themselves in their own situation, say, how am I contributing to the problem, and how can I be part of the solution?
I had listened to another interview with you recently, and this was particularly interesting because in the prairie provinces, we're hearing that Trudeau is doomed at the next election. The polling doesn't seem to indicate that at the moment.
I don't think so at all.
But what was interesting is that you had said that you believe that the federal Libs will increase their majority, possibly through splintered voting. So what's the factors, or what's your insights into this?
I don't recall saying that they'd win a bigger majority because of splintered voting. I recall saying, and I'll reiterate, I believe they're going to win a bigger majority because they're effectively collapsing the federal NDP vote. Is if you look at the polling with the federal Liberals, I think they won their last majority with 39.5%. they're still polling, I think, at least Justin Trudeau's approval rating is at 39%, even after the SNC-Lavalin scandal. And people are going to forget about that soon enough. But what he has been doing, if I was an NDP voter, I would look at what Justin Trudeau has delivered. And, whether it be economic regulation or even gender-based economic regulation with the marketing of being gender-based regulation. As an NDP voter, the folks who kind of have those values, I'm sure they would see Justin Trudeau as delivering more than the current federal NDP right now. And if you look at Jagmeet Singh's numbers, it seems to reflect that. I think it's hard to give every part of the country everything they want. And this is what Justin Trudeau's father did effectively, was pit the West against Ontario and Quebec. And we see the same thing happen now, except now BC is getting thrown into the mix. And Justin Trudeau's coming, this economic regulation and kneecapping of Alberta's industry is playing very well on the Lower Mainland, and you even have the Premier of BC now talking about trying to regulate the flow of Alberta bitumen through his jurisdiction. So it's a major political issue, and I think, again, from our perspective in the West and in Alberta in particular, it's terrible. But if I look at it from an electoral strategy, I think what Justin Trudeau and his handlers or his supporters, his staff have done is brilliant from an electoral standpoint, and I think that everything that they've done is explained and makes sense when you look at it through those lenses.
Peter, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thank you for having me, Jess. I really appreciate it.
This has been a production of the Canadian Business Quarterly, a division of Romulus Rising Proprietary Limited. All rights reserved. You can stay up to date with the Canadian Business Quarterly, including our publications, newsletters, and podcasts by visiting www.thecbq.ca and clicking on subscribe.